The bullet tore through the funeral silence, turning a day of grief into a nightmare. She thought she could disappear after pulling the trigger, but she didn't know she'd just declared war on the city's most feared deputy commissioner. If you want justice served hotter than hell, like, subscribe, and stay locked in. The sun had no business shining that day, but it did. A warm July light draped itself over the hillside cemetery like a taunt, golden and cheerful against the weight of grief that hung over the mourners. Rows of black suits and dark dresses clustered around a casket draped in white roses and a silver cross. The deputy commissioner stood at the head, his jaw locked and hands clasped behind his back, his dark uniform perfectly pressed as if discipline might hold back sorrow. His mother had passed quietly, a stroke in her sleep. After a long life and a slow decline, they had been prepared for it, or so he thought. His son, Leo, clutched his hand with tiny fingers wrapped in the cool grip of confusion. The boy was too young to understand death fully, but he knew what goodbye meant. He had asked earlier why Grandma couldn't just come home from the hospital. Now he stood silent, eyes flicking between the crowd, the flowers, and the open grave as if hoping to spot her one last time. The deputy commissioner did not speak when the priest offered him the chance. He shook his head once and returned to silence, letting the eulogy pass without interruption. There were things he could say about his mother, but not in front of everyone. Not today. He was supposed to be the unshakable one, the man who stood tall for others to lean on. This wasn't a day for breaking. In the back, near a tree that swayed slightly in the breeze, a figure moved. Not quickly, not suspiciously at first, just a woman in black like all the others. She wore a brimmed hat that cast her face in shade. The red gloves should have stood out, but no one seemed to notice. Leo whispered something. The deputy commissioner leaned down to hear him better, not catching the movement in the corner of his eye. The priest's voice faltered slightly in the middle of a psalm, and then the silence became too tight, too expectant. The gunshot came like thunder, one sharp crack that split the world in two. There was a moment, suspended in shock, where no one moved. Then screaming began. Chaos exploded like a flood. The deputy's hand, which had just been holding Leo's, was now slick with blood. His son crumpled to the ground, eyes wide in confusion more than pain, mouth forming a question he could not finish. "Leo!" The word tore from him as he dropped to his knees. He pulled the boy into his arms, feeling the warmth of blood spread across his dress uniform. He scanned wildly for the source of the shot, but people were running now, scattering behind gravestones, diving for cover. The woman in the red gloves was gone. A second shot never came. Officers rushed toward the scene, guns drawn but with nowhere to point them. An ambulance was called before the deputy even gave the order. A young patrolman tried to help, offering to carry Leo to safety, but the deputy waved him off with a fury that dared contradiction. He held his son himself, sprinting across the grass toward the parked vehicles. Somewhere in the distance, the sirens had already begun. They reached the hospital in record time, escorted by 2 cruisers and a helicopter that broke protocol to make room on the landing pad. Inside, nurses moved with terrifying calm, cutting through the uniform and lifting Leo away from his father's grip. The deputy stood there, alone and drenched in blood, as the surgical doors closed in his face. It took a long time before someone came to speak with him. The hallway outside the emergency unit was empty, but for a few officers standing by. The chief of police arrived at some point, putting a hand on his shoulder and saying something about support and presence, but it all passed through fog. When the surgeon finally emerged, she didn't smile. That was what the deputy noticed first. She had her mask pulled down, and her expression was grave, but not defeated. "He's alive," she said. "The bullet missed anything vital. It passed through his side. We stopped the bleeding. He's stable, but we'll monitor him closely." The deputy closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, he was no longer just a father. He was the commissioner once more, and someone had just made a very calculated mistake. His first call wasn't to his wife, it was to his lead investigator. He needed surveillance footage. He needed a list of everyone who had attended the funeral. He needed ballistic reports. And he needed it all fast, because someone had brought a gun to his mother's funeral and aimed it at his child. And now he was going to tear this city apart until he had answers. The funeral was declared a crime scene. The cemetery was locked down, and officers canvassed the area for any evidence the shooter might have left behind. The crowd had seen little, most of them too shocked or distracted to offer useful descriptions. But there were mentions of a woman, a hat, red gloves. The deputy commissioner reviewed the footage from the cemetery's security cameras himself. The angle was poor, the resolution worse, but he caught a glimpse. A flicker of black moving along the edge of the trees, hands flashing red just before the shot rang out. Then nothing. The gun had a suppressor. That was clear now. It explained why there hadn't been a second blast, why some had heard a loud pop but others only felt a shift in air. It was professional, clean, precise. This wasn't a random act of violence. She had meant to shoot the boy. That was the only conclusion that made sense. And for what? There was a time, years ago, when the deputy had worked directly with intelligence agencies on task forces that never made the papers. There were names he'd buried, files he'd sealed, enemies he'd crippled behind closed doors. He had always known there would be consequences, but he had never imagined they would arrive like this. Not through his son. At home that night, his wife sat beside Leo's hospital bed, hands clasped in prayer. The deputy watched from the hallway, not yet ready to go in. His clothes had been changed. The blood was gone from his hands, but not from his mind. Every time he blinked, he saw Leo's eyes staring up at him. Not afraid, just confused, wondering what had gone wrong in the world. The deputy commissioner turned and walked away, back toward the elevators. There would be time for comforting later. Right now, there was only one truth that mattered. Someone had fired a shot into his family, and whoever they were, they had no idea what they had just started. At first, the blood had just looked like spilled wine, dark and slow as it soaked into the folds of Leo's little white shirt. Even now, hours later, that image clung to the deputy commissioner's thoughts like tar. It played behind his eyes each time he tried to sit still. The doctors had stopped the bleeding. The surgery had gone well. His son was stable. Everyone repeated those facts like a chorus designed to soothe, but they did not soothe him. He had seen too many men die after being called stable. He had delivered that news himself, had stood on too many doorsteps and uttered words like critical and hopeful and holding on. Now those phrases felt hollow when aimed at his own blood. He sat in the hospital waiting room, with a coffee gone cold in his hands. Outside the window, the city's lights blinked on one by one, casting a reddish glow on the skyline. Below, cars threaded through the streets, ordinary people going about their ordinary lives. None of them knew that a child had been shot beside his grandmother's grave earlier that day. They didn't know a killer had melted into their midst and walked away unseen. They didn't know the boy who might not walk again had been chosen, not caught in the crossfire. This had not been random. It was targeted, and the one responsible had walked away clean. His phone buzzed beside him. He answered before the second vibration. "We're compiling the footage," said Detective Ramirez, his lead investigator. "But most of it is useless. The cemetery's cameras are outdated. We're pulling from surrounding businesses, traffic cams. Someone's got to have a shot of her leaving." He said nothing for a moment, then finally asked if they had anyone in custody. "No," Ramirez said. "Not yet. No ID either. A few witnesses said red gloves. That's all we've got that's consistent. No one saw her face." The deputy's knuckles whitened around the paper coffee cup. He had trained his detectives to keep calm under pressure, to stick to facts and avoid speculation. But even in Ramirez's voice, he heard it. Frustration. The mounting dread of a case turning cold before it could warm. "What about the slug?" he asked. "Ballistics has it. It's clean. No grooves we can match. Whoever did this used a polished weapon and probably dumped it right after." He leaned forward in his seat, pressing the heel of his hand into his forehead. He could feel the beginnings of a migraine pressing behind his eyes. The lights in the hospital were too bright, the walls too white. It felt sterile, empty, and fake. Outside, crime surged and evolved, but inside they still used clipboards and whispered platitudes. "I want a list of everyone who attended the funeral," he said. "Full names, known associates, any priors, any possible connections to me or to my mother. Cross-check with department records. If someone had a grudge, I want to know it." There was a pause on the other end, a hesitation that prickled his skin. "We're doing that," Ramirez said. "But I need to tell you something else. The chief's office called. Internal Affairs wants a preliminary incident report by tomorrow." He blinked slowly. His hand curled into a fist. They think this was a professional hit, Ramirez continued, voice lowered now. And they think it's related to one of your past cases. Off the books, maybe. They're digging through your old sealed files. A flush of heat rose in the deputy's chest, followed by a cold wave that stiffened his shoulders. The air in the room felt heavier somehow. He stood and began pacing, keeping his voice even. They're looking in the wrong direction. This wasn't retaliation against me. It was something worse. He didn't wait for Ramirez's response. He ended the call and stared out the window again, watching a bus slow to a stop, watching a couple laugh as they stepped off. The normalcy of it angered him. He wanted to drag the city into his pain. He wanted sirens to scream and people to tremble the way his son had when he looked up from the grass, asking without words why his body wasn't working. The door to the waiting room opened, and his wife walked in. Her face was pale and streaked with exhaustion, but she had not cried in front of anyone. She was not the sort to break easily. She sat beside him and took his hand without saying anything. The silence between them was thick, but comforting in its familiarity. "He's sleeping," she said eventually. "The nurse said he'll wake up soon. They gave him something for the pain." He nodded. The words barely registered. He had not yet allowed himself to imagine what would happen if Leo didn't wake. He had not let the possibility shape itself in his mind. It was too dangerous. If he went down that path, he wouldn't come back. "They said you saw the shooter," she added. "Did you?" "Only a glimpse. She wore red gloves." His wife frowned, puzzled by the detail. He understood the confusion. Red gloves at a funeral were strange, almost theatrical. They stood out, which suggested carelessness or arrogance. "I think she wanted to be seen," he said aloud. "She didn't wear those gloves by accident." "But why? Why shoot a child? Why our son?" He shook his head. The only answer he had was rage, and that wasn't enough. When he left the hospital an hour later, he didn't go home. He went straight to headquarters. His office was quiet, untouched since the day before. On his desk were still the condolence cards from colleagues who had heard about his mother's death. He pushed them aside and unlocked the drawer that held his restricted access files. The folders were color-coded and sealed with old secrets. He flipped through them slowly, searching for the ghost of a name, a face, a motive. He was halfway through when a knock came at the door. Detective Ramirez stepped in holding a tablet. "We might have something," he said, and handed over the device. The screen showed a still from a gas station camera less than 2 blocks from the cemetery. The image was grainy, but the timestamp was perfect. The woman was visible in the background. Hat, coat, red gloves. She wasn't walking. She was running. The deputy enlarged the frame and stared at her silhouette. Something in her shape tugged at his memory. Not the face, which was turned away, but the posture. The way she leaned forward, her arms close to her body, her stride long and precise. It felt familiar, and not just from training. He looked up at Ramirez. His voice was quiet now, colder than it had been all day. "She's done this before." Ramirez frowned. "You think this is connected to a past op?" "I know it is. She's not just a killer. She's military. Or used to be." Ramirez hesitated. "You're saying this wasn't just an assassination. It was a message." The deputy nodded. He couldn't prove it yet, but he felt it in his bones. Whoever she was, she had chosen the day, the place, the target. She had known when to shoot and how to vanish. But she had made one mistake. She didn't know who he was. Not really. Not yet. She had shot his son and walked away. Now she had given him a purpose. And he was going to find her. The night deepened, but the deputy commissioner did not sleep. He sat in his office, the harsh desk lamp casting a cone of sterile light across scattered case files, old mugshots, internal memos, and surveillance stills. The woman in the red gloves stared up at him from a frozen image, her face obscured, but her intent burned through the frame. It was a professional job. She had executed it with precision, timing, and a level of calculated composure he had not seen in years. That kind of discipline came from training, not instinct. She had experience, and she had purpose. The red gloves were no accident. He had replayed the gas station footage nearly 50 times. She passed through the frame in less than 2 seconds, moving with a runner's stride and a predator's posture. She had her face turned slightly, just enough to avoid the lens, and she vanished out of view without hesitation, without panic. She had a route planned, an exit prepared. She had done this before. It wasn't her first shot, and something in his gut told him it would not be her last. Ramirez returned just after 2 in the morning, eyes bleary, suit rumpled, holding a fresh report. The lab had rushed the analysis of the bullet and the trajectory. The slug pulled from Leo's side had come from a custom firearm. No serial number, polished to avoid ballistic match. The casing had not been recovered. That wasn't surprising. What caught the deputy's attention was the information buried in the last page of the report. The angle of entry, the height of the shooter, the distance from the shot. She had fired from within 20 feet. That was close. Very close. Close enough to see Leo's face. Close enough to hear him gasp. She had aimed at a child and fired from nearly point-blank range. That fact solidified something that had been shifting in the deputy's mind since the funeral. This was not collateral damage. This wasn't a missed target or a botched assassination. This was personal. The footage from surrounding businesses had turned up almost nothing useful. After the gas station, the woman disappeared. She had either changed clothes or climbed into a vehicle that left the scene unnoticed. She knew how to erase a trail, and she had done so well. But the deputy was not relying on camera footage alone. He had one more tool, the kind of resource the department never acknowledged officially. At 3:15 in the morning, he left headquarters through the rear lot and took his personal car out of the city. The streets were empty, the traffic lights blinking red and yellow in tired rhythm. He drove with purpose, windows down, letting the summer night air cut through the fog in his head. An hour later, he turned down a gravel road that wound through the industrial outskirts, ending at an old warehouse hidden behind a chain-link fence and overgrown brush. Inside, the building was dark, but the back office had a dim light seeping through the blinds. He knocked once, hard, and pushed open the door without waiting. The man inside looked up from a cluttered desk of monitors, wires, and half-empty fast-food bags. He was in his early 40s, pale and sharp-featured, with fingers that never stopped moving. The deputy knew him only as Finch. He had worked in cyber intelligence before an internal scandal had derailed his career. The deputy had pulled him out of the wreckage and kept him useful, off the grid. Finch leaned back and raised an eyebrow. "Bit late for a social call, Commissioner. I need a name." Finch blinked once, then gestured toward a chair. "Always the simple requests with you." He accepted a flash drive the deputy handed over and plugged it into his system. The screen flickered, then filled with surveillance clips, freeze frames, angles from various cams. Finch began typing, pulling facial mapping software, gait analysis, image enhancement. It would take time. The woman had hidden herself well, but Finch was talented. He worked quietly for 20 minutes before leaning forward, squinting at the screen. "You said she's military?" "She moves like it." Finch nodded. He paused the video and zoomed in on the gas station frame. He isolated the silhouette, sharpened the blur, and applied a gait model. Small feet, neutral pronation, right shoulder higher than the left. Scar on the calf, surgical. That's not civilian. That's someone who's carried weight. Special forces or deep ops. Definitely trained. He tapped again, running a cross-check with archived personnel databases. He shouldn't have had access to most of them, but Finch had long ago stopped worrying about legality. After several minutes, the computer chirped softly. A face appeared on the screen. A profile. Her name was Marina Vale. The deputy felt the world narrow. Finch leaned back slowly. "You know her." He did. He had not heard that name in years, but it came back to him like ice water down the spine. Marina Vale had been part of an interagency operation nearly 7 years earlier. She had served as an undercover operative, embedded with a smuggling ring in the southern corridor. The mission had gone sideways. 3 agents died. She was listed as killed in action during the extraction. But here she was, alive and hunting. The deputy clenched his jaw. Marina had been one of the most effective deep-cover agents the department had ever run. She had been disciplined, brilliant, and dangerously independent. He had worked closely with her during the planning phases of that failed operation. He had reviewed her psych evals, her mission protocols. He remembered her intensity. She had always pushed limits, sometimes bending orders in pursuit of outcomes. Her handler had called her uncontainable, but she had gotten results. Then she vanished. The body recovered from the scene had been burned beyond recognition, but it had been identified as hers through a dog tag found nearby, or so they had been told. She had never really died. He stood there, staring at the grainy image of her running from his son's funeral. He tried to understand why she would come back now, why she would target Leo. What had changed in 7 years? What had she learned? What had she lost? Finch looked up again. "There's more," he said. "She's not just alive, she's been moving. Last known alias placed her in Brazil 3 years ago, then in Marseille, then Bangkok. She's been everywhere, under the radar, and she's not working alone." The deputy felt a chill settle over his shoulders. He needed to know who she was working for, what she was doing in his city. Why now? He turned back toward the door. "Find everything you can, every alias, every known associate. I want her history unburied." As he walked back into the night, he felt a familiar weight settle over him. It was the same feeling he had carried during Black Ops deployments, when the mission blurred the line between justice and survival. But this time, it was different. This time, it was personal. She had returned from the dead. She had fired into his family. And now she was going to learn what happened when you crossed the line twice. The office was dim and silent, the air thick with a tension the deputy commissioner had not felt in years. He stood before a corkboard filled with printed surveillance stills, old photographs, and notes scrawled in black ink. In the center, pinned like the centerpiece of a manhunt, was the enhanced image of Marina Vale sprinting away from the funeral, her face just visible enough to confirm what his gut already knew. She had not died 7 years ago. She had gone underground. He stared at the image, thinking back to the operation that had brought her into his orbit. It had been called Night Glass, a task force blending intelligence and law enforcement designed to dismantle a smuggling pipeline running weapons and classified tech across borders. She had been recruited straight from special operations, her file glowing with recommendations, her record nearly flawless. He remembered the first time he saw her in the briefing room, sitting still, while everyone else fidgeted and talked over one another. She had the kind of presence that silenced a room without effort. During the Night Glass planning phase, she had pushed for deep insertion, requesting more time inside the target network than protocol allowed. She wanted full immersion, convinced that only by becoming part of the machinery could she understand who was pulling the strings. Against his better judgment, he had approved it. It had been the right call tactically. Operationally, they got results. She delivered names, routes, lists of compromised assets. But her behavior became unpredictable. She stopped reporting in. Her messages came sporadically, coded and vague. Her handler warned that she was slipping too deep. Then everything collapsed. A meet went wrong, 3 agents died, and the last message from Marina was a desperate call for extraction. When the team arrived, they found a burning compound and a body too damaged to identify visually. The dog tag was hers. They closed the file. Now, the file was open again, whether the department wanted it or not. He had already received 2 calls from Internal Affairs and a third from the mayor's office. Each voice was more nervous than the last, cautioning him to tread carefully. They had not said it outright, but he heard the message clearly. Marina's return was a landmine. If she had turned rogue, it raised questions about oversight, about accountability, about how a presumed dead operative could walk back into their city undetected. And if she was working for someone, the implications were worse. Much worse. His phone rang. It was Ramirez. "We just finished digging into the safe house data Finch recovered. You'll want to see this in person." He drove across the city without delay, passing through neighborhoods now waking under the summer dawn. The safe house was an unassuming brick structure near the edge of the financial district, rented under a fake name, paid through a shell corporation. Inside, the scene was surgical. Sparse furniture, no personal items. Everything in place except for a single wall covered with printed photographs. Some were aerial shots, others were taken with long lenses. All of them showed him. In one, he was walking Leo to school. In another, he was leaving a press conference. One particularly disturbing image showed him asleep on the couch in his own home, Leo curled up beside him. He recognized the vantage point. It had been taken through the living room window. Marina had been watching him for months. There was no dust on the photos, no smudges. This was recent. She had planned the funeral shooting carefully. She had followed his routines, studied his movements. She had picked a moment of vulnerability and made it hers. A young tech officer handed him a folder. "We found fragments of shredded documents in the trash. One partial name keeps coming up. Cora Medlock." The deputy sat down and read the name aloud. It sounded familiar, though he could not immediately place it. The name surfaced again in another document fragment, this one containing a list of contacts and offshore bank account routing numbers. Finch joined them, moments later, holding a tablet. "You need to see this. I ran a background on Medlock, former federal liaison for covert funding approvals, quietly retired 3 years ago after an internal ethics probe. She moved to the private sector and vanished off the radar." He paused, then handed over the tablet. Before she vanished, she was in charge of approving budgets for Nightglass. The connection locked into place like the final piece of a loaded weapon. "She burned Marina," the deputy said quietly. Finch nodded. "Or she used her and let her take the fall." It explained everything. Marina had gone deep, been abandoned, presumed dead. But if she had survived, if she had learned that the mission had been compromised from the top, she would not forgive that. She would hunt, she would plan, she would return. The deputy stood slowly, his thoughts now moving in a new direction. "She thinks I was part of it." Finch looked uncertain. "You weren't. I signed the final operational clearance. She doesn't care if I knew. She just sees the chain of command." It made a sick kind of sense. Marina had not come to kill him outright. She had not made a political statement. She had not staged an attack at a government building or leaked files. She had gone for his son. The message was clear. She wanted him to feel what she had felt: abandoned, betrayed, grieving. Ramirez leaned in. "What do we do now?" The deputy looked back at the wall of surveillance photos. He focused on the one of him and Leo, sleeping side by side. The image turned his stomach, but it also hardened something inside him. "She wants me to chase her," he said. "She wants me off balance, acting on rage." Finch asked the question carefully. "So what are you going to do?" The deputy didn't answer right away. He reached up and removed the photo from the wall. Then he turned and left the room. He made only one stop before returning to headquarters, a detour to an old storage unit 2 miles from the precinct, one only he had access to. Inside was a steel trunk containing files, encrypted drives, and a sealed manila folder with Marina's name written in thick black marker. He had kept it after the mission closed. Not out of guilt, but because something had always felt unfinished. Now, that instinct was justified. He opened the folder on his desk, flipping past deployment rosters and coded mission briefings until he found the psychological profile. It described Marina as intensely loyal, dangerously intelligent, and capable of profound detachment from human relationships when under stress. The evaluator had flagged her as a long-term risk if left unsupported. Support had been pulled, trust had been severed, and now she was back. The deputy commissioner stared down at the last page of the file. It ended with a single phrase, circled in red ink, "Not to be underestimated." He sat alone in his office, the city stretching beyond the windows, full of shadows and noise. He had built a career chasing ghosts, but now one of them had come back to make him bleed. And this time, he would not wait for her to strike again. The desert town was smaller than he remembered. A strip of cracked asphalt ran through the center like a tired scar, bordered on both sides by shuttered stores and forgotten signage. Most of the buildings looked empty. A few people lingered outside a diner, smoking and watching the dust settle on the horizon. The deputy commissioner drove slowly past them, scanning faces, taking in the silence that clung to this place. Finch's data trail had led here. Marina Vale had spent 3 nights at a rundown motel just outside the town's edge under a false name. That was 4 days before the shooting. He parked his car in front of the motel office and stepped out, letting the heat press against him. It was mid-morning, but the sun already glared down with a weight that made sweat form along his back within seconds. He walked into the lobby, where a battered, oscillating fan tried and failed to circulate the stale air. A man with a thin moustache sat behind the desk, flipping through a sports magazine. The deputy removed his badge and laid it on the counter. "I need your guest logs, specifically the name Patricia Martin. 3 nights. Last week." The man blinked, then nodded slowly. He turned to a drawer behind him and pulled out a faded binder. He flipped to the page and pointed. She checked in, paid cash. Room 6. Didn't talk much. Anyone with her? Not that I saw. Came in late, left early. Had a military duffel and a limp in her left leg. That detail struck him. Marina had sustained a leg injury during the failed extraction. She had hidden it well back then, but pain never disappeared. It simply moved to the background. He thanked the man and walked the length of the motel. Room 6 was at the far end, its window covered in newspaper from the inside. The door was locked, but the deputy used a universal police override card to slip it open. The room was bare. The bed had not been used. Dust coated the edges of the windowsill, but someone had been here. The closet door was ajar, and inside, he found the faint outline of a tripod marked in the carpet. She had set up surveillance. Across from the room, beyond a stretch of dry grass, stood an auto shop and a small general store, a perfect perch for watching arrivals and departures. He knelt and examined the floor beneath the tripod indentation. A single fiber clung to the carpet, red, synthetic. One of her gloves had torn. Finch had been right. Marina was not working alone. The amount of coordination it took to set up an escape route, cover her tracks, and maintain this level of stealth suggested a network. It might be small, but it was tight, loyal, and well-resourced. He left the room and drove deeper into town. Ramirez had flagged a truck rental on the day after Marina checked out. The driver had used another false name, but the clerk had remembered the face. A woman. Sharp jawline, blonde hair, intense eyes, no smile. She had rented a flatbed pickup with out-of-state plates and disappeared by nightfall. That gave him a window. He began cross-referencing vehicle traffic leaving the town using state surveillance data. Finch worked from his remote office to piece together a path. After 2 hours, they had a breakthrough. The truck had been spotted heading north, 2 gas stops, 1 fast food drive-through. Then it dropped off the grid near a mining road that hadn't seen activity in over a decade. The deputy changed vehicles, switching to an unmarked black SUV with heavier suspension. He followed the trail out of town, winding through barren hills and long stretches of desert that bled into the horizon. The radio crackled occasionally with check-ins from Ramirez, but for the most part, he drove in silence. The road narrowed, then disappeared entirely, swallowed by dust and weeds. Tire marks veered toward a ridgeline. He followed them. The road became little more than a suggestion, but he pressed on, until he reached the top of a rise and looked down on a small cluster of buildings nestled against a canyon wall. They were remnants of the old mining town, half collapsed and sun-bleached, no power lines, no movement. But as he lifted his binoculars, he saw something out of place. A dark green tarp fluttered gently near the opening of one of the buildings, new, unworn. Next to it, tire tracks carved into the dirt. Recent. He descended on foot, moving low, rifle drawn and eyes scanning for motion. The heat beat against his skull, but he kept his breathing even. He reached the outer edge of the cluster and slipped behind a rusted-out truck, peering through the windshield into the shade of the structure. There was a figure, moving. He radioed in his position. Finch responded instantly. Signal's weak. But if that's her, you need to be ready. You are 2 hours from backup. He did not wait. He moved fast and quiet, sweeping the building in calculated bursts. Empty room, empty crate, then a flash of movement behind him. He spun. Marina stood there. She had changed. Her face was thinner, her skin tougher, but the eyes were the same. Cold, focused. She raised a pistol but did not fire. Instead, she smiled. Always 10 steps behind, she said. He raised his rifle, but she ducked behind a beam and vanished through a side door. He chased her into the open, feet pounding the dirt, gunfire cracking once behind him. Not hers. Another shooter. He threw himself behind a concrete barrier as bullets chewed the air. So she was not alone. He pulled a smoke grenade from his vest and lobbed it over the barrier. The desert filled with a grey haze, thick enough to mask his retreat. He moved fast, circling around the side of the building, flanking. He saw a man dart through the smoke, mid-30s, beard, compact submachine gun, not Marina. He dropped the man with 2 shots to the leg and a knee to the face. but Marina was gone again. The truck she had used was already rolling away from the canyon, kicking up dust in its wake. He ran after it, heart hammering, lungs burning, but it was too late. The truck vanished into the heat shimmer of the horizon. He walked back to the building and found a small duffel bag left behind. Inside were burner phones, a foreign passport, and a flash drive wrapped in cloth. He didn't speak until he was back in the SUV, driving toward a signal strong enough to upload the drive to Finch. When Finch called back, his voice was urgent. "This is big. The flash drive contains a ledger, payment logs, supply chains, target profiles. Your son is one of 5 names." The deputy felt everything go still. She was sent to kill him. No, she was paid to shoot him, but not to kill. Why? I think it was a warning, a message. There's more. You're next. He stared at the road ahead. The desert rolled by, vast and uncaring. Whoever had brought Marina Vale back into the world had done so with precision, with motive. This was not about revenge anymore. It was war. The office was locked when the deputy commissioner arrived. It was still early, not yet 8, and the city had only begun to stir. Downtown traffic remained light, the streets washed in pale sunlight, but inside headquarters the building buzzed with a quiet tension. The receptionist rose when she saw him coming, eyes wide, unsure if she should speak. He passed without a word, bypassing the main elevators and taking the back stairwell 2 at a time. He needed privacy, and he needed Ramirez. When he reached the 6th floor, Ramirez was already waiting. His tie was loose, his eyes shadowed by a long night, but he held a folder in one hand and a tablet in the other. "We decrypted the flash drive," he said without preamble. "Finch finished at 5 this morning. It's not just payment records. It's operational planning, routes, equipment lists, schedules." The deputy followed him into the secure analysis room and closed the door behind them. 2 monitors lit the space in a cold glow. A digital map stretched across one, dotted with color-coded pins. The other displayed a list of names, 5 in total. Leo's name was second from the top. The deputy sat slowly, scanning the screen. "These are children," he said. Ramirez nodded. "All of them, ages 6 to 10, all from law enforcement families. Parents either active or retired from federal agencies. 2 have already been injured in unrelated incidents this year. 1 nearly drowned during a boating accident. The other was involved in a freak home explosion. Both incidents were ruled accidental. But now," he let the thought trail off. It did not need to be finished. The deputy stared at the names. A cold realization settled into his chest, heavier than any grief he had felt since the shooting. These were not random acts of violence. They were calculated warnings, part of something bigger. This was not Marina acting alone. She was a weapon, not the hand that guided it. "Do we know who paid her?" he asked. "Not directly. The funds moved through a series of dummy corporations tied to offshore accounts. Some traces go back to shell entities registered in Macau and Geneva. But Finch found an anomaly. One of the payment nodes shared an encryption protocol with an old federal server. It was repurposed, but its code signature is still traceable." "Whose server?" Ramirez hesitated. "Homeland Operations, from the Nightglass era." That name again. It kept returning like a splinter under the skin. Nightglass had always felt unfinished. The files had been sealed, the investigation buried, and the blame swept clean. The deputy had moved on, or at least tried to, but now the loose ends had begun to bleed. Marina had been left behind, burned in the fire of political convenience, and someone had taken advantage of her pain. He leaned back, eyes closed, letting the implications form. "This isn't about revenge anymore. This is a purge." Ramirez looked confused. "They are eliminating connections," the deputy explained. "People tied to failed black projects, agents who knew too much, witnesses, and now the families of those agents." "But why now, after all these years?" The deputy stood and paced. His mind turned over possibilities, each darker than the last. Something had changed. Some new initiative or cover-up had been set in motion. Maybe an old case had been reopened, or maybe someone feared exposure. The timing of his mother's death, followed by Leo's shooting, felt too clean to be coincidence. His mother had once handled classified casework as a consultant in her younger years. She had access to records that had never been digitized, records that someone might want erased. He returned to the map. The pins showed the movement of Marina and her known associates across 3 countries. They had traveled with precision. Every appearance was brief, every disappearance clean. They moved like ghosts. Then something caught his eye. A red pin near the East Harbor. A shipping terminal. "What is that?" he asked. Ramirez clicked to expand the entry. Shipment logs. A container passed through customs 3 days before the funeral. It was flagged under a random inspection but cleared with an override. That override came from a badge ID no longer active. Whose ID? Former field coordinator. Died last year in a car crash. His access should have been revoked. The deputy stared at the terminal manifest. 1 container. Origin, Berlin. Destination, unknown. The contents were labeled as industrial equipment, but the inspection report had been altered. Finch's notes confirmed that the file had been scrubbed remotely and rewritten using an old Homeland encryption key, the same code that showed up on the payment network. It was a smuggling route. He looked up. It's not just a cleanup. They are moving something. They are using this network to push assets through and taking out liabilities along the way. Ramirez leaned in. What kind of assets? The deputy didn't answer. His mind was already ahead, picturing the flow of untraceable materials, weapons, data, personnel, maybe all of it. The silence from federal oversight was deafening. If someone within the government had gone rogue, using old infrastructure and forgotten agents, it would be nearly impossible to track, unless you had once been inside it, unless you still remembered where the bodies were buried. He picked up the flash drive again. The files on it were not just for Marina. They were instructions, coordinates, names, timelines. Leo's name had been time-stamped. The exact date and hour of the funeral were logged next to it. That meant the shooter had received her orders days in advance. The planning was meticulous, which meant someone knew his movements better than they should have. He turned to Ramirez. I want full surveillance on every family in that file. Quiet. No uniforms. No patterns. Use off-duty personnel. Tap private security if you need to. If even one more child is touched, I will hold everyone in this building accountable. Ramirez nodded and left without another word. The deputy sat alone again. He stared at the frozen screen. The list of names burned into his vision. He felt the full weight of his responsibility now, heavier than the badge on his chest or the title etched outside his office door. They were not just hunting ghosts. They were hunting the future. He thought of Leo, still lying in that hospital bed, unaware of how close he had come to death. The bullet that tore into his side had not just been an act of violence, it had been a declaration, a message. The war he had tried to leave behind had found him again. But now, he was awake. And this time, he would not play defense. The soft beep of the monitor was the only sound in the hospital room. It was rhythmic, steady, but carried a tension that the deputy commissioner could not ignore. He had spent the last 2 nights in the small visitor chair beside his son's bed, alternating between drifting sleep and wakefulness marked by twitching nerves. Leo lay motionless, his small chest rising and falling beneath the thin blanket. Tubes connected to his arms and side. A dull bruising surrounded the bandage where the bullet had entered. For all the years the deputy had spent chasing violence, he had never imagined watching it follow him home. A nurse entered quietly, checking Leo's vitals without speaking. She offered the deputy a nod before leaving again, her presence like a whisper. He watched the door close, and then turned back to Leo. The boy stirred. It began with a flutter of his eyelids, then a slow, confused blinking. His head shifted slightly on the pillow. The deputy rose to his feet, heart racing. He leaned over the bed and gently took his son's hand. Leo, he said, voice low, steady. You're safe. You're in the hospital. Leo's eyes found him slowly. Recognition came in waves. His lips parted. He tried to speak but coughed instead, a raspy sound that made the deputy wince. He poured water into a cup and held the straw to Leo's lips. The boy sipped weakly. Dad, he whispered. I'm here. You're going to be okay. Leo's brow furrowed, a look of fear returning to his face. His voice, still hoarse, formed the question before the deputy could stop it. Why did she shoot me? The words hung in the air, far too large for a hospital room. The deputy closed his eyes for a moment before answering. I don't know yet, but I will. Leo's eyes shimmered. Did Grandma come back? No, buddy. She's gone. But she would have been proud of you. You were so brave. Leo said nothing for a while. He turned his head slightly, looking toward the window. The morning light filtered through the curtains, soft and golden. Then he spoke again, barely above a whisper. I saw her, the lady, before. The deputy leaned forward. Before the shot? Leo nodded. She was there. A long time. I saw her gloves. Red. I remember them. The deputy felt his heart stop. You saw her before she shot? Leo's eyes met his again. She was at the old house. That night the fire alarm went off. A jolt went through him. The old house. The one they had lived in 2 years ago. There had been a night when the alarm had gone off in the middle of the night. They had evacuated. The fire department had arrived, but found no smoke, no fire. They called it a false alarm, a possible wiring fault. The deputy had dismissed it after checking the system. But Leo was remembering something different. She was outside, Leo said. I looked out the window. She had a red bag. Same gloves. He gripped the edge of the bed. Are you sure? Leo nodded, more certain now. I told you I saw someone, but you were on the phone. He remembered that night. Leo had said something about a lady, but the deputy had been distracted, speaking with a federal contact about an upcoming investigation. He had dismissed it as a dream, or the product of a child's imagination triggered by the alarm. Now the truth settled over him like a crushing weight. Marina had been watching even then, 2 years ago, long before the shooting, long before any of the children on the list had been harmed. It meant she had been preparing for much longer than anyone realized. The deputy leaned down and kissed Leo's forehead. You did good, he whispered. You helped me more than you know. Leo drifted back to sleep, the medication pulling him gently under again. The deputy remained beside him, but his mind was no longer in the room. He pulled out his phone and contacted Ramirez. Find the incident report from 2 years ago. Fire alarm. Residents at 1819 Burroughs Street. I want all responding personnel reviewed. I want security footage recovered from nearby properties, if any still exists. Someone staged that alarm to test us, possibly to plant surveillance. I want that place combed top to bottom. Ramirez responded quickly. We'll pull it. You think she was in the house? I think she was close enough to learn our routines. That means this was more than surveillance. This was a psychological operation. She was watching how we reacted, how long it took responders to arrive, how we handled emergency protocol, and we missed it. He ended the call and sat again. The revelation filled him with fury. Marina had infiltrated his life in ways he never imagined. She had been close, silently studying them. If Leo had not remembered the gloves, the connection would never have surfaced. An hour later, Ramirez called back. You were right. We pulled traffic cam footage from a nearby intersection. A woman matching Marina's description appeared on the sidewalk 10 minutes before the alarm triggered. No clear shot of the face, but the timestamp lines up. She walked away calmly once the fire department arrived. What about inside the house? Anything unusual? No break-in signs, but the technician who inspected the alarm system was from a third-party contractor. We ran his name. It's an alias. Real identity is unknown. The company shut down 6 months after the incident. The deputy closed his eyes. It was more than infiltration. She had planted someone. She had created the event and used it to place eyes on his home. She had learned the layout, the entry points, the blind spots, and he had let it happen. The guilt rose fast and hard. As a father, he had failed. As a lawman, he had been blind. But no longer. He stood and stepped into the hallway, calling Finch as he walked. Leo remembered something. Marina was watching us 2 years ago. She tested our emergency response. I want you to find everything you can about the contractor who serviced our fire system. I want bank records, personnel files, former employees, and I want you to reanalyze that flash drive. Look for embedded data, layered encryption. If she was planning this long ago, there's more hidden in those files. Finch was already typing. I'll start now. But if she has been playing this long game, you're not just dealing with a rogue agent. You're dealing with someone who built her own operation inside your life. The deputy did not respond. He knew it already. Marina had laid the trap long before the first bullet ever fired. She had studied them, lived in the shadows of their routine, manipulated every weakness. This was more than vengeance. This was the execution of a plan years in the making. But she had made a mistake. She had let Leo live. And now, with a single memory, his son had pulled her mask away. The note was waiting when he returned to his office. It had been slid under the door, folded neatly and unsigned. No smudges, no handwriting he recognized. Just a single sentence, printed in capital letters with mechanical precision. I stay out of this or I finish what I started. He read it 3 times before picking it up. The weight of the paper told him everything he needed. It was heavy stock, not cheap copier paper, but the kind you found in personal stationery sets. Expensive, precise, intentional. Whoever had left it wanted him to know this was not a random threat. This was a promise, delivered personally and placed where it would strike deepest. He stood at the window and looked down at the city. The streets bustled with the usual morning rhythm, people pouring into the sidewalks, taxis moving in hesitant fits through traffic. They had no idea that a war had quietly bloomed behind the glass of this office. They lived their lives in peace while he carried the knowledge that someone was hunting his family. Hunting others too. Names on a list, children marked without understanding why. And now this threat, hand-delivered. Someone had been inside the building, past security, past locked doors. He called Ramirez immediately. Within minutes, the hallway was filled with officers and internal tech staff. Every camera feed was pulled, every visitor log reviewed. The entire building was locked down without explanation. But the footage showed nothing. The cameras in the hallway outside his office had cut to static between 1:03 and 1:07 a.m. Just 4 minutes. Long enough for someone to walk in, leave the note, and disappear. Long enough for Marina. The deputy commissioner read the note again. He folded it into his jacket pocket and walked out of his office without a word. He called Finch from the parking garage. She was in my building. I know. I tracked a signal spike in the department's Wi-Fi network early this morning. Someone accessed your personal log. They used a cloned badge signature to get in. Was it hers? Not directly. The signature was masked, but the timing lines up. Whoever it was bypassed 3 levels of encryption in under 2 minutes. That is not just skill. That is intimate knowledge of our system architecture. He didn't need to be told twice. Marina had worked inside this very system once. She knew the structure. She had helped build parts of it. He got into his car and pulled out of the garage without sirens, without lights. There was only one place he could go now, only one way to draw her out. He stopped by his house first. It was empty. His wife and Leo were still under round-the-clock medical supervision with private security, just as he had ordered. He stood in the doorway for a moment, scanning the familiar shapes of furniture, the corners where memories lived. Then he locked the door behind him and walked down the hallway into the study. The safe was behind the bookcase. Inside it was a single item wrapped in cloth and sealed in a double-latch steel case. He opened it. The pistol inside was custom, matte black with polished silver inlays. It had been issued to him during an intelligence assignment overseas and officially decommissioned after that mission ended. But he had kept it. It had saved his life once, and now it would again. He loaded it slowly, listening to the smooth clicks of the chamber. Then he holstered it and stood in the center of the study, waiting. He did not wait long. The creak of the back door reached him a second before the pressure changed in the hallway. He moved toward the door, silent. When he stepped into the kitchen, she was already there. Marina. She stood with her back to him, examining a photograph that hung on the wall. It was a picture of Leo at age 5, missing his front teeth and grinning with cake on his face. Her head tilted slightly as she stared at it. "I told you to stay away," she said. He raised his weapon. She turned slowly, her hands at her sides. "You walked into a hospital to shoot a child," he said. "I didn't shoot to kill. You aimed for his chest. I aimed to send a message." He kept the gun trained on her, but his finger did not move. "Why?" She took a slow step forward. "Because the people who left me behind are still pulling the strings. I needed you to feel the loss, even if only for a moment. Only then would you understand what we were both used for." He narrowed his eyes. "You could have come to me. You could have told me what you knew. They would have killed me before I got a word out. You know how this works. Who are you working for now? She smiled, but it was sad. No one. Not anymore. The people who hired me for this job, they were part of something larger. A machine I no longer believe in. I took their money to learn their names, and now I am erasing them. He saw her eyes flick to the window. You're not here to kill me, he said. No, she agreed. I'm here to tell you that you have one chance. Walk away. Protect your son. Burn the files. Let them disappear. He stepped forward. And if I don't, then they will kill you, and they will do it so cleanly that your own officers will call it natural causes. They have used you long enough. You're too visible now. Too dangerous. The air between them felt sharp. Give me names, he said. Let me take them down the right way. There is no right way. Only clean endings. I don't believe that. Then you are still clinging to an idea that was never real. Her eyes softened slightly. I didn't want to hurt him. I meant to miss. But I had to get your attention. You had it the moment I saw his blood. They stood there, two sides of a line neither could cross. Then she stepped back toward the window. They'll come for you now. You made too much noise. They know you're close. Let them come. She looked at him one last time. I left you something. In the place they trained us. The chapel. You remember it? He nodded. Go tonight, alone, if you want the truth. Then she was gone. She moved through the back door and vanished into the dusk like smoke. He stood for a long time after she left, the silence of the house stretching around him. Then he holstered his weapon and walked to the window, staring at the street where she had disappeared. She had warned him. She had threatened him. But she had also told him where to go. And he would, because the truth was all he had left. He arrived at the chapel just after midnight. It stood half-sunken in the ground, weathered by time and neglect, surrounded by dry brush and the low hum of desert wind. The training compound had been decommissioned years ago, but the buildings had never been fully demolished. They had simply been locked, forgotten, left to age in silence. The chapel was the last structure standing whole. It had been used not for prayer but for lectures, briefings and conditioning. It was where they learned not to ask questions, not to doubt orders, and not to believe in anything but the mission. The deputy parked his vehicle a quarter-mile out and approached on foot, taking in every sound. An owl called once. A distant thump of some old machinery drifted from beyond the hills. Otherwise, the night pressed in close and still. He moved through the tall grass, his boots muffled against the sand. No lights shone from the chapel. The windows were boarded over, the front doors chained shut. He circled the building and found what he was looking for on the east side, a loose panel near the foundation. He crouched and pried it open. Inside, darkness. The air was stale. He slid in, drawing his flashlight and sweeping the beam across the forgotten interior. Dust clung to the pews and the pulpit. A stack of folding chairs had collapsed in one corner. On the far wall, the old blackboard still bore traces of chalk diagrams and mission routes. He stood slowly and took a breath. There was a folder sitting at the front, placed neatly on the pulpit. He walked to it without hesitation. A single word had been scrawled across the top in dark marker. Redemption. He opened it and began to read. Inside were copies of memos, emails, internal communications, and field reports that had been redacted before ever reaching the public record. It told a story he had feared existed, but never had the proof to confirm. The night glass operation had never collapsed due to bad intel or enemy interference. It had been sabotaged from within, rerouted to cover for the smuggling of illegal tech into hands that were never supposed to have it. A high-ranking official, once a liaison between the intelligence community and private defense contractors, had orchestrated the betrayal, and when the mission ended in blood, they buried the evidence. Marina had been listed as dead, not because they believed it, but because it made the story cleaner. He turned the pages slowly. One showed a photograph of a meeting in Berlin. 3 people stood near a window. One of them he recognized as Cora Medlock. The second was a man he had seen only once before, years ago, at a closed briefing on counter-cyber threats. The third was himself. It had been cropped from a surveillance image. His presence in the frame would be enough to sink his career, maybe even get him arrested under the current climate. It did not matter that he had not known what the meeting was really about. Perception had become more dangerous than action. Beneath the photo, A note had been handwritten by Marina. You were there. You may not have known, but you were part of it, and they will not let you forget. He closed the folder and took a breath. A sound broke the silence. Not from outside, but within. He turned, gun drawn in a blink, and scanned the room. Movement came from behind the pulpit. Slow, careful. Then she stepped out. Marina. This time she did not raise a weapon. Her hands were visible, fingers curled loosely. Her eyes were tired, her posture different, not defensive, not threatening, just present. You read it, she said. Yes. Then you know. I know what they did to you, what they tried to do to all of us. She nodded. I spent 7 years running, from them, from myself, from what they turned me into, but it never left. The faces, the silence, the weight. You could have come to me sooner. She gave a faint smile. I tried, but every door closed, every call flagged. I was erased before I could even start speaking. And the shooting? Her smile disappeared. I regret it more than anything I've ever done. I wanted to scare you, to make you feel what I felt when they left me for dead. But the moment I saw him fall, I knew I'd gone too far. You almost killed my son. I know, and I'll carry that. Why meet me here? Because this is where they built us. I thought it was fitting to dismantle their legacy from the same place. He kept his gun trained on her. I should arrest you. You won't. Why not? Because you know I am not your enemy. A silence settled between them. She stepped forward and laid something on the pulpit beside the folder. A flash drive. Its casing was marked with the same symbol used on Nightglass intelligence data. This contains the rest. Names, accounts, contracts, enough to end it. He reached for it. And what happens after that? I disappear. You go public. You do what you've always done. Fight for justice. He looked at her carefully. They will come after both of us. They already are. He slid the drive into his pocket and stepped away. Marina turned toward the back exit. I'll go first. You'll follow after 10 minutes. Don't contact me again. If I'm alive, I'll know what you do with this. If not, it won't matter. She walked into the shadows. He heard the old wood creak as she opened the side door and slipped out into the night. The deputy commissioner stood alone in the chapel, the folder in one hand, the weight of it pressing against every muscle in his body. The truth was here, the proof they had all killed to hide. The question now was whether he had the strength to expose it. He looked once more around the room where he had been trained to never hesitate. And then he walked out the front door, into the desert wind. The city never slept, not really, but on the morning that followed his visit to the chapel, the deputy commissioner felt like it had paused, just briefly, like the machinery of power had hiccuped, uncertain whether to keep spinning. The silence in his office was different now. Not the silence of grief or shock, but the silence that came right before the blow landed. He stood at the edge of the windows, watching the people move below, his reflection faint in the glass. Somewhere out there, Marina was gone again, maybe out of the country, maybe in hiding, maybe dead. He did not know, but she had left him with something more dangerous than a bullet. Truth. The flash drive was real. Finch had confirmed it within an hour of decrypting the first layer. Names, banking networks, logistics records, and unredacted communications spanning more than a decade. Marina had not only uncovered the entire spine of the operation that had betrayed her, but she had also traced the money into current campaigns, current agencies, current leaders. The past was not simply alive. It was growing, mutating, feeding quietly on the structures it once served. He turned away from the window and looked at the printed documents spread across his desk. They were stacked in precise columns, categorized by relevance and risk. One folder held names he had trusted. Another contained outlines of operations he had signed off on, not knowing they were covers for deeper, darker efforts. His own initials appeared on several authorizations, clean and by the book, now smeared by context. The people who had ordered the hits, paid the agents, buried the bodies they had used him as a shield. They had relied on his integrity, his spotless record, to launder their corruption through legitimate chains of command. Ramirez entered quietly and placed a newspaper on the desk. The front page showed a photo of the hospital where Leo had been recovering, alongside a headline that asked whether political enemies had targeted the deputy commissioner's family. The media had caught the scent, though they still lacked details. Leaks had started overnight, and it was only a matter of time before the story spiraled. "There's movement downtown," Ramirez said. "Medlock is in the city. She arrived on a private flight at dawn. No public itinerary, no meetings scheduled." "She knows," the deputy said. "Or she suspects. She's here to clean the last pieces." Ramirez hesitated. "We could wait. Build a tighter case. Take this through official channels." "No," the deputy said. "If we wait, we lose control. By noon today, this will be buried again. Too many people are invested in silence." Ramirez glanced at the documents, then at the man behind the desk. "Then we go public?" "Not yet. First, we take her down." The confrontation came 2 hours later, not in some secret facility or midnight alley, but in the marbled lobby of a private consulting firm near the river. Medlock was seated in a glass-walled conference room, dressed in tailored grey, her posture sharp, her expression blank as she read from a digital tablet. She looked up as the deputy entered with 2 plainclothes officers and a legal observer from the mayor's office. "I wondered how long it would take you," she said. "You left a long trail," he replied. "I left exactly the trail I meant to. You only followed it because she pushed you." The deputy placed a printed page in front of her. It showed a wire transfer from a corporate account in Luxembourg to a shell organization linked to the operative who had shot Leo. "She was working for you." Medlock did not blink. "She was useful. She was also unstable. You sent her to the funeral." "No. I gave her a list. She chose her moment. I didn't ask for details." The deputy leaned closer. "You ordered the deaths of children." "I authorized containment measures. The difference is in the paperwork." "You're done." "Am I?" Medlock tapped her tablet, revealing an encrypted file. "Do you want to know what happens if you try to prosecute me? Do you want to see the list of foreign dignitaries, intelligence partners, and current legislators who would be implicated? You don't have enough walls to hang all the traitors." He did not answer. He simply stepped back and motioned for the officers to take her into custody. She stood without resistance, hands behind her back, her expression fixed in faint amusement. "You'll make a great martyr," she said as they led her away. "But it won't matter. The machine will survive you." He watched her disappear into the hallway and then turned back toward the conference table. He left the folder of evidence behind, open and visible. By sunset, the first headlines hit the airwaves. "Arrest made in federal corruption probe. Deputy Commissioner uncovers rogue network." The language was cautious, but the storm had begun. In the coming days, more arrests would follow. Whistleblowers would step forward. Documents would be leaked. Investigations would ripple across agencies like tremors after a deep earthquake. He would not be able to control it. But that was no longer the goal. Back at the hospital, Leo was sitting up in bed, his face pale but bright with curiosity as he flipped through a comic book. The deputy entered quietly. His wife rose from the chair and met his eyes. "Is it done?" she asked. He nodded. "It started." She embraced him, tightly, without words. Then she stepped back and motioned toward their son. Leo looked up. His smile was small, but real. "You got the bad guys." "We're getting there," the deputy said. "Good." Leo reached for his hand and held it. "I saw you on the TV. They said you stopped the people who hurt me. I did what I had to. For you." Leo squeezed his fingers. "I want to be like you when I grow up." The deputy sat beside him and let the moment settle. He thought of the chapel, of Marina's voice in the dark, of all the people who would never see justice, but whose names were no longer buried. He thought of what came next, the hearings, the backlash, the danger, but also, maybe, something better. "They tried to bury us at her funeral," he said quietly. Leo looked at him, puzzled. "But we rose from the grave," the deputy finished, and smiled. Outside, the city pulsed with noise and light, and for the first time in years, he felt like he was facing it with both eyes open. The cost had been high, the wounds would linger, but the truth was out, and it was louder than any gunshot. And he was not done yet.